coping and seething. You just can't accept what you're seeing. Yes, you're coping and seething. The truth it is scalding, and now you are molding and coping so hard. Coping and seething.
It is major coping and seething for Ukraine after the G20 summit. So the G20 summit occurred on the weekend of September 8th. It was a 2-day summit, and there weren't really high expectations for this summit, actually. There was the non-attendance of Putin and Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. So the leaders of maybe the two most important countries right now in the world, Russia and China, were not present. They did send representatives, though. But it was quite clear that the G20 summit this year was going to be less eventful than in past years. And this, despite the fact that India really wanted the G20 to make a splash, because India was hosting it, was the president of the G20 on the rotating basis that it takes part in. And India was hoping to make what it called a diplomatic splash, a diplomatic masterclass. So India was really hoping to come out of this looking like a world leader. And India believes that it did come out looking like a world leader. But this was much more eventful, I think, than what meets the eye. And what I mean by that is that, well, not much happened at the summit in terms of results. We saw India and the United States and the European Union announce that they're doing this economic corridor, which will involve Saudi Arabia and UAE as kind of a counterweight to BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative. In my opinion, that's a nothing burger, because the United States doesn't generally like to invest much infrastructure development in other countries and with other countries. So it's likely to be a very slow project, this economic corridor. And if it's going to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, it has a lot of catching up to do, given that the Belt and Road Initiative, China's flagship infrastructure development project globally, is more than $1 trillion worth in US dollar value. And it already has 147 countries signed up, and it has thousands of infrastructure projects completed or underway. So this economic corridor has a long way to go and is really a nothing burger, because we can't trust the United States really in anything. And so there wasn't really any other splash at the G20 to really announce, except for Ukraine. And so at each G20, they come out with a leader's declaration. And for context, the G20 is not that old of an institution. It started at the beginning of the 20th century. It was really an attempt by the United States, as it was forging unilateral, hegemonic wars around the world, as it was asserting itself as the global superpower without a competitor. This hegemonic empire decided that it wanted to look the part of a multilateral partner, a multilateral player. So the G20 was such an attempt to bring in countries in the post-Cold War order, Russia, China, along with many of the European countries, Italy, the UK, France, etc., bring them all together and essentially do nothing, because that's what the G20 has been. It's been really a big nothing burger of a mechanism. It has long been known to be simply a public relations outlet for the United States diplomatically, and it hasn't really had any significance for quite some time. And so this year, though, the G20, and last year as well in Bali, so the G20 in New Delhi and the G20 in Bali were increasingly significant because of the Ukraine conflict. And the United States, I believe, and I believe the collective West as a whole, thought that they were going to take advantage. You saw the media reports that the European Union wanted to take advantage of Russia and China's so-called absence, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin's absence, that they were going to show the world that they can lead this kind of institution and make significant diplomatic headway. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, but the biggest and most significant piece of the G20 summit was its leaders' declaration statement, and in particular, what they said on Ukraine. And I want to compare the statements from Bali and the statement from New Delhi 2023, from Bali 2022 G20 summit, to show you just how much things have changed, and for the worse when it comes to Ukraine. Ukraine is seething and really coping hard with the fact that the entire world has essentially rejected its attempt to frame itself as the victim of Russian aggression, because the G20 could not come to an agreement about this. And I'm going to show you what happened. So the Financial Times reported on this. This was huge news. And this, I'm going to show you just how Ukraine's foreign ministry spokesperson took this in a minute. But here the Financial Times reports that the G20 summit drops reference to Russia aggression against Ukraine. Joint language does not condemn Moscow's invasion after China refused to repeat critical wording. G20 leaders have failed to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine in a joint statement after China and Russia rejected language that blamed Moscow for the conflict. The New Delhi summit declaration refers only to the quote-unquote war in Ukraine, a formulation that supporters of Kiev, such as the U.S. and NATO allies, have previously rejected, as it implies both sides are equally complicit. That statement, hammered out over weeks of negotiation and hours of intense debate between diplomats as the summit was already underway, is a blow to Western countries that have spent the last year attempting to convince developing countries to condemn Moscow and support Ukraine. So that's kind of the rip for the collective West, is that the G20 is supposed to be their platform to demonstrate that they have buy-in from the rest of the world, because it incorporates countries. They admitted the African Union, and India is very proud of itself for being the president of the G20 when the African Union was admitted. And of course, the EU is trying to take credit for that, despite the fact that Europe is literally the disaster for Africa, the colonial disaster for Africa for centuries. Doesn't matter. They're trying to take credit for it. But the point is that the G20 is supposed to be this kind of public relations stunt where the collective West says, hey, look, we can actually work with the world rather than destroy it. Of course, the opposite is true. But here, they have not been successful. The United States has not been successful. The rest of the collective West has not been successful. Indeed, they've been an abject failure in convincing the rest of the world, mainly the global South, that this conflict is worth condemning Russia over. And so it talks about the previous G20 declaration made in Bali last November, referred to quote-unquote Russian aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Western diplomats said China's refusal to repeat that formulation was critical in pushing host India to propose compromised language. Of course, blame China. Although, indeed, China did not have that position at the last summit either. China was not going to condemn the conflict in 2022, as they aren't going to do in 2023. But in 2022, there was willingness to allow that statement to come out. And that's because China's one country within this mechanism, and they're not going to hold it hostage. So it is a fact that referring to the war, India's external affairs minister, S. Jaishankar, said, it is a fact today that Ukraine is a very polarizing issue, and there are multiple views on this. In all fairness, it was only right to record what was the reality of the meeting rooms, and this is the reality that is sought to be captured. So that was what it was adopted. I want to show you. Okay, so that's the big news. And now I want to show you the differences between the summits, because I do have both of the differences between the leaders' declaration, because I have both of them here. So I'm going to show you first, and this is coming straight from the White House. They're republishing of the G20 Bali's leaders' declaration in 2022. And I want to show you what they said about Ukraine. So here it says, this year we have also witnessed the war in Ukraine further adversely impact the global economy. There was a discussion on this issue. We reiterated our national positions as expressed in other fora, including the UN Security Council, General Assembly, blah, blah, blah. And so the UN Security Council deplores in strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and demands its complete and unconditional withdrawal from the territory. Most members, see, key. Most members strongly condemned the war in Ukraine and stressed it as causing human suffering and exacerbating fragilities in the global economy. So that was the statement. In that, in a sense, it was still kind of muted, but at the same time, they were willing to say the Russian Federation, the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. That was the language that was used, even if it was just repeating that UN Security Council vote, the resolution that was voted upon, which many countries did abstain from, as well as were absent from. But many countries, 141, voted to condemn Russia. And that's because the United States and the collective West mobilized the entire world to do so, at least much of the world, much of those countries that they could organize. So there is the statement there. So it's actually not as extreme as the Western mainstream media wanted to paint it as. And that's because there was still opposition from Russia and from China at the Bali summit. But here is the new G20 summit leaders declaration. This is the one that was formulated under India's tutelage. And here is point number 8, where Ukraine is concerned. It says, while recalling the discussion in Bali, we reiterated national positions in resolutions adopted by the UN Security Council resolutions, citing the same ones, and understood that all states must act in accordance and manner with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter in its entirety. In line with the UN Charter, states must refrain from the threat of use of force and territorial acquisition. The use of nuclear threats is inadmissible. And I think there is, here we go. We highlighted the human suffering and added impacts of the war in Ukraine with regard to global food and energy security, supply chains, macro financial stability, inflation, and growth. But you notice no Russia here. There is no mention of Russia. And here it says, we will unite in our endeavor to address the adverse impact of the war on the global economy and welcome all relevant and constructive initiatives to support comprehensive, just, and durable peace in Ukraine. But you notice no condemnation of Russia wherever Ukraine is concerned. That is very different from even just that singular statement. And all it takes is one statement to set the tone for how, one sentence to set the tone for how the statement frames the issue. So in Bali, it was framed as the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine must be condemned. And look at the UN resolution. It was so significant, so new at that time. It was so much supposedly in the collective West court. Fast forward now to today, 2023, if September, and what is the reality? The reality is that there was so much disagreement about the conflict in Ukraine 1 year later from the last summit that there was no buy-in. And there was very little buy-in. It was the collective West versus the rest, and the rest ended up winning out. And I don't think it's a coincidence that with India leading and India being very neutral on this question and maintaining ties with Russia throughout the conflict, it's no coincidence that India hosting the G20 summit this year led to this kind of change. I think that they are deeply connected. So this outcome was very disturbing for Ukraine, very disturbing. And I'm going to tell you why. And there are many reasons why this outcome was so disturbing for Ukraine. Okay, so first, I want to show you what the United States has said about this. Okay. So first of all, here's Reuters. Reuters, and this is the cope here, right? Because on the one hand, you have France playing attack dog, as has been the case with the conflict in Ukraine at many points. You have France talking at one side of his mouth, saying it wants to be a mediator for peace, which we saw how the Minsk Accords went. Not so good, not really genuine there. But you hear Macron talk about, the also popular Macron, talk about how he wants to be a mediator for peace. And then he turns around and says that actually Russia was isolated after the G20 summit in New Delhi. It shows how they were united when the reality was 100% different. You heard the foreign minister of India, Jaishankar, say the exact opposite. He said there were many disagreements, and so this is the position we were able to come to, one that doesn't condemn Russia. So this is what Macron, this is a misleading headline, because I'm going to show you what the United States had to say. The G20 summit in New Delhi ended on Sunday as India handed over the bloc presidency to Brazil, while both U.S. and Russia praised a consensus that did not condemn Moscow for the war in Ukraine, but called on members to shun the use of force. And this is the key thing to point out here, is that of course, Russia wasn't unhappy with this outcome at the G20. Of course, it's pleased to see how the world is so divided, how much of the world actually wants to remain at least neutral on this conflict so that these countries can maintain ties with Russia. And these sanctions are increasingly unpopular. So yeah, Russia's going to be satisfied with this outcome, but it's the United States that was curiously also satisfied, which I think has Ukraine absolutely in a tailspin over this. And I'm going to show you their response in a minute. But here we go. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters that the summit declaration, quote unquote, does a very good job of standing up for the principles that states cannot use force to seek territorial acquisition or to violate the territorial integrity and sovereignty or political independence of other states. Does that sound like a confident, a comfortable, a happy Jake Sullivan? They're saying they're happy. Jake Sullivan is saying he's happy. The United States is happy with this statement. But don't you think they would have been happier if Russia was condemned? I think so. But I also think one of the reasons why they didn't condemn this statement is because the temperature is cooling on Ukraine. The counteroffensive is failing. Ukraine cannot win this conflict. And I believe that one of the reasons why Jake Sullivan was willing to say this, despite how much it would anger Ukraine, is that the United States, its foreign policy establishment, is starting to cool on this prospect of a forever war that never changes in character, of a war that leads to major power conflict when the situation is very grim for Ukraine. So I think the United States is hedging its bets. It's going to permanently support Ukraine, but will it permanently support a forever proxy war conflict that's having immense impact, a negative impact on the global economy? And essentially, it runs the risk of anyone who can fight, who decides to remain in Ukraine, becoming obliterated by Russia. That's a very real possibility. It's a very real possibility. Every single person in Ukraine that is conscripted and is willing or forced to fight is going to die. So that's not a reality that either Ukraine nor the United States can take, because eventually you run out of people. Not only that, but you're running out of weapons. And so the White House, I think, is cooling on the conflict. So that was really triggering, regardless of what Macron says. You know, he says that the G20 declaration was not a victory for Russia. He said the G20 confirms once again the isolation of Russia. Today, an overwhelming majority of G20 members condemn the war in Ukraine and its impact. Well, maybe the war in Ukraine and its impact, but the G20 members are not willing to come to a consensus or any kind of majority agreement on how to frame the conflict, because one could say that just condemning the conflict does not necessarily condemn Russia. And that is the point of this. So Ukraine's government, they came out, the Zelensky regime came out and said, this is nothing to be proud of, this G20 leaders declaration. And I want to show you what the foreign ministry spokesperson of Ukraine had to say on Twitter. I mean, this is serious copium that he is inhaling, that he is snorting right now. So Oleg Nikolenko, this is what he had to say on X, formerly known as Twitter. He said that the G20 adopted a final declaration. We are grateful to the partners who tried to include stronger wording in the text. However, in terms of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the G20 has nothing to be proud of. This is how the main elements of the text could look to be closer to reality. So here is Ukraine, this tiny statelet, this proxy government, this government that doesn't have an independent bone in its body, yet it feels compelled and is so injected with hubris that it is willing to publicly go against its masters who agreed to this leaders' declaration, or at least allowed it to come out without protest, so much so that Jake Sullivan praised the damn document. But here you have Nikolenko saying, oh, well, let me just correct this for all of you because I'm relevant somehow. And look at what he did. Ukraine, concerning the war against Ukraine, Russia must act in a manner persistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter in its entirety. On war against Ukraine, Russia must refrain from the threat of force to seek territory acquisition against territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of any state. On war against Ukraine, Russia's use of threat of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. On Russia's war of aggression, so you see what I'm saying? I mean, this is just absolutely pathetic. This is not how a spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs should be behaving. This is not only unprofessional, but really, if you just look at his corrections, it actually makes the original statement look that much more powerful. I mean, think about it. As he's trying to put in these edits, when you read it again and you hear this language of all states must act in a manner consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter in its entirety concerning the war in Ukraine, what does that mean? It means there are countries who believe, Russia, for example, to a large extent China, and maybe some others in the G20 that we just don't know how they're talking in the back rooms. They believe that other states are a problem here. And who are those other states? Well, it's not just Russia. It's participating in this conflict. The entire collective West is. So if you read closely here at this original statement as Nikolenko is trying to edit it and to make some grand statement, what he's actually doing, I believe, is reinforcing the powerful nature, the powerful message being sent by this statement. And so really, it just exposed how the collective West is actually, they allowed themselves to get self-owned, and Ukraine is now feeling the heat from it. They are feeling triggered by this statement because, and they should, because what this says is that all states must act in accordance to international law. All states meaning the United States, NATO, yes, they all must act in accordance to the UN Charter. Of course, they're not, but that is the point of the statement. So Nikolenko, incredibly triggered by this. Ukraine, incredibly triggered by this, and as they should be. I mean, this is an abject embarrassment for Ukraine. It really is. And so that was the biggest story at the G20 summit, believe it or not. The biggest story at the G20 summit was Ukraine, but not for the reasons that Ukraine had hoped it would be. Ukraine, I believe the United States and the collective West hoped that there would be a stronger condemnation, but I think they knew there wasn't going to be. I mean, if you just, put your finger to the sky and observe global developments, you see over and over again, even the European Union violating their own sanctions to trade with Russia. You have the entire world continue to trade with Russia because the entire world also needs access to its energy markets. And you also see the expansion of BRICS and the expansion of multipolarity happening in real time, which is a huge red flag and signal that the unipolar order that the G20 represents, with the United States at the head, is increasingly becoming outmoded. And Ukraine has nothing to feel. It can't say anything about the G20 summit other than express disappointment, because it should be disappointing, because not only is Ukraine losing on the battlefield, not only is Ukraine losing thousands upon thousands, now the numbers are up to 66,000, the counteroffensive dead, and it hasn't even been a full season yet. They've been doing this for 3 months. Now that you've had 66,000 dead, you've had most of NATO's military equipment that was donated completely obliterated, destroyed, or captured. Now that this has occurred, and that there really isn't much left for Ukraine to take advantage of, they're not going to make many more gains, if any, from here on out. Ukraine is going to continue to receive aid, as they have recently after Blinken's visit to Kiev. But even that aid, it's just well known that it's not going to be enough. Even with these surprise attackums, right? Even with that, okay, try to fire them on Ukraine and Russia, on Crimea, and Russia's going to shoot them down. And now we're hearing murmurs and rumblings that come this month, September 2023, Russia is going to wage a monstrous offensive now that Ukraine's counteroffensive has been destroyed. So the prospects for Ukraine are very bleak, and they are not happy that the G20 essentially abandoned them. The G20 essentially abandoned them. I mean, that is all you can say about it, that the G20 abandoned Ukraine, and that means the United States is increasingly looking to jump ship. Now, it's not going to, because the conflict in Ukraine is incredibly lucrative, it's incredibly profitable, but also it's existential, and there are forces that want to see it continue in some form. But I believe that this is increasingly looking like the United States, and if we see the G20 summit leaders declaration as kind of a barometer of this, it's looking like the United States, with all of its talk of freezing the conflict and slowing it down, it's looking increasingly like the United States wants to maintain this conflict permanently, but it wants to do so in a manner where the scope of it is manageable, meaning that it is not manageable to wage counteroffensive after counteroffensive, lose all these men, lose all these weapons, and leave the United States really with nothing left to give other than its so-called valuable stockpiles that it wants to have preserved for other conflicts, right? So the United States is not going to let itself, given that it is this military albatross that really depends on militarism around the world to maintain hegemony, it's not going to let Ukraine drain that capacity in full, even when every single venture that the United States is hoping and wishing it could wage around the world on China and whoever else, even though that those efforts will ultimately end in failure, it wants the opportunity. The neocons, the foreign policy establishment, want opportunities. They are opportunists at heart. They're not going to let Ukraine take that away. And so the miscalculation of the neocons, this complete folly, this completely and utterly ridiculous assertion that a proxy war on Russia would essentially end the Russian Federation, throw Putin out. You remember early on in the conflict in March 2022, Mr. Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, going up there and saying, we're going to remove Putin from power, right? All of those assertions that Russia would fall because of sanctions, they were always ridiculous, that Russia would not be able to handle what NATO had to offer Ukraine on the battlefield. It was all smoke and mirrors. It was all bluster. And now the bluster is blowing back in Ukraine's face. It's blowing this really sharp and uncomfortable sand right in Ukraine's face, the dust of war right in the eyes of Zelensky and company. And it is not pretty. And the G20 summit leaders declaration shows that Ukraine made a gamble with the United States. These coup artists, these fascists, these far rightists, these putschists that make up the Ukrainian regime, they made a dangerous gamble with the devil, and the devil predictably burned them. And this is going to be, I think, a theme in the months to come, where the United States is going to push ever so gently, in secret, without much, hopefully they hope, not much fanfare from the Ukraine side, push them into some kind of negotiated settlement, push them into concessions, but still offer Russia very little, meaning that the fighting will continue and Ukraine will continue to suffer major losses and defeat, especially if the reports are true and Russia begins its offensive following the failed counteroffensive from Ukraine this fall. If that happens, we're going to see the shape of this conflict look more and more bitter for the collective West. And I believe the public relations, the media hype, the discussion will shift from how do we support Ukraine in a forever war forever to how do we frame this in a manner that makes it look like we have higher ground and we're going to wait and see. And we already see that happening. You've seen the mainstream media reports. 2024, 2025, Ukraine will be ready. Let's just hunker down. Or let's rebuild our production capacity militarily, United States, NATO. Let's focus on that. And eventually we will be ready to supply Ukraine with what it needs. I believe that's what we're going to see for quite some time, and that the reports are only going to get more and more grim from the battlefield. And also, when it comes to things like the G20, the message for Ukraine is going to be a lot less enthusiastic. There's going to be a lot less energy behind it. And you might just have blunders like this one for Ukraine, where mechanisms like the G20 cannot and will not be able to give the United States and NATO and Ukraine what they want, which is this total propaganda campaign saying that Russia is the aggressor and it is the provocateur, it is the provoker of this conflict, it is the aggressor, and it needs to be condemned. I think that ship has sailed and it's never coming back. And we can thank the multipolar world, the efforts of countries like Russia, China, even India in this case, among others in the global south, for helping steer the world back into rationality and into a place where the prospects for this conflict coming to an end are, and the conditions in the environment are taking shape, even if there is one side, the United States and NATO, that is completely and totally without any interest in such an endeavor. The entire world, though, is in a different place. And that is what matters. And that's why the G20 leaders declaration was so triggering for Ukraine. It's because most of the world just wants this to end, and they're not willing to sacrifice their interests to help the United States and NATO fight a war against Russia. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.